I'm discussing the Chinese economy with former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale. And in the context of what's happening at the current moment, where China has posted $1 trillion of trade surplus, but that is something India is aware of, because the trade deficit with China, India has one of the highest as far as India is concerned. But in the list of trade deficits with other countries, perhaps India comes much lower. So, how should India deal with Chinese, practices, trade, and the dependence in many cases that India has on Chinese goods and Chinese raw materials, Vijay?
Yeah. So, I think we first have to look at the statistics, Nitin. What is significant is that between 2019 and 2023, or the fiscal years 2019-20 to 2023-24, India's exports to China were more or less stagnant at 16 to 18 billion dollars. But China's exports to India doubled almost from about 60 billion dollars to well over 100 billion dollars. So what we are looking at is a massive trade deficit of $103 billion this year, which is still growing. Now, people tend to focus only on the percentage of our trade with China as an overall percentage of that trade, and that is very small because China's total trade volume is $6 trillion and the India-China volume is only $140 billion, which means we roughly account for 2% of trade. But what we should really be focusing on is the percentage of the deficit we have with China as a percentage of its overall trade surplus. If you look at that, then the trade deficit of $103 billion is 11% of the Chinese trade surplus of $1 trillion. In other words, for every $10 that China has a trade surplus, India contributes a full $1 to it. And that is a very, very significant number, which we must look at. It is not sustainable, and this is not a commercial issue, it is a political issue. And we must anticipate that the situation will worsen because while exports have grown, Chinese exports to India have grown, imports are constantly slowing down, not just with India, but globally, because of the Make in China campaign that President Xi has launched. And therefore, a reset of the trade terms becomes difficult. Now, the problem becomes even more complex because key industries on the Indian side, take textiles for instance, machinery, pharmaceuticals, organic chemicals, electronics, auto components, all of them are dependent in some form or another on Chinese intermediate products or machinery or finished goods or active pharmaceutical ingredients and so on and so forth. So you cannot also drastically crack down on exports there because it will affect your top export performing sectors of the Indian economy. You also have the problem of the price wars that China is engaging in certain sectors like the pharma sector in an effort to hollow out the Indian economy. So you have a problem there as well. And then China is not making any progress in reducing non-tariff barriers, although it repeatedly promises to do so in things like government procurement of IT-enabled services, which is a big Indian export, or phytosanitary restrictions on the export of grains, food and fruit and vegetables, or regulatory hurdles for, let us say, registering pharmaceutical products and drugs. Now, when all this is combined, it provides a significant challenge for the government because what government has to do is then to pivot away without seriously damaging our own economy. And what is required, in my opinion, is a systematic government support to industry, which is industry specific. You can't target every single industry in the economy. Number two, it has to be policy based. It cannot be a one-off event. And thirdly, it has to be financially sustainable. If you want companies to buy to go to alternative sources where the same
Sources.
equipment is available, and that might cost 1.5 to 2 times what China is offering because China is engaging in price wars, government has to find some way of supporting our industry so that the pain is not borne by Indian business alone, but also by the government. So I would say We are facing a formidable challenge, but it is necessary for Indians to recognize how much we are contributing to China's trade surplus. That must be the starting point from which a political consensus and a consensus with business must be built to make a fundamental pivot away from the Chinese economy.
Absolutely. I think it's a catch-22 for the government. If they crack down too hard, then the industry suffers, like you mentioned, and the economy has a setback. Some of the some products like Apple is now producing from India. There are some efforts to sort of move away from Chinese supply lines to what they call resilient supply chains. But that has not really worked, except for some bans that India put on some of the apps, and
Yeah.
some non-tariff barriers they've been put in on some of the security sensitive sectors like telecom and electricity, all that. So, like Apple recently complained that they are not allowing some of the parts to come to India. Even the experts are not being sort of allowed to come. That may be India's fault, of course, or India is being choosy or selective. So, what is the way out then? Because people have to understand that our dependence on China has grown so ridiculously high over the past quarter century or maybe 20 years that it's not easy to sort of go away from that in say 2 or 3 or 4 years. It has to be a long haul.
In my view, the informal sanctions that China is gradually placing on Indian industry is a greater concern than the trade deficit. In a sense,
That's right.
sometimes it is easier to solve a trade deficit than to solve what China is doing. And in the last 6 months, bits and pieces of news have been gradually leaking out of Indian industry about how China is trying to strangle certain sectors. We know the case where tunnel boring machines for large infrastructure projects are being denied. We have also heard recently that there have been some restrictions placed on ship to shore cranes, on oil rigs, on large dredging machines for ports. And most recently, there are rumors that has instructed its own companies not to transfer technology on lithium ion batteries to India. And on the heels of this now comes an admission by Foxconn, the original equipment manufacturer for Apple, that China is preventing certain sophisticated machines for the next generation of Apple phones to be exported to India. I don't know how much more information you need to understand that this is now a systematic application of industrial sanctions to strangle India's growth by the Chinese government. But industry still seems to be hesitant in voicing its apprehensions. And in that situation, China's propaganda or disinformation focuses precisely on the points you mentioned. They will point to the fact that India has denied investment clearance to one particular investment, or that India is denying visas to professionals and businessmen. And this is to deflect attention from these sanctions, from the greater structural problem that we have. So what we really require, Nitin, is an industry-wide study that must be taken on a war footing by CII and FICCI both, as well as other chambers of commerce, on which industries have begun to face these problems. Because until we know how widespread these problems are, we are never really going to be able to determine policy.
True.
So this is a huge problem and we need to deal with it.
We at Adani, under the leadership of our chairman, Mr. Gautam Adani, have always tried to address the needs of the country and citizens of India. For us, Atmanirbhar Bharat is not a slogan. It's non-negotiable for India to help achieve self-reliance and self-sufficiency.